In the first episode ever of Vistas Voices, I sit down with Richie Bloomfield, an assistant professor and PhD student focusing on agro-food systems and farm policy. We engage in profound discussion about the complexities of small-scale farming, agricultural policies, urban farming, and the importance of developing local food systems. Richie shares his work with urban roots and discussing his journey in agriculture, as well as the challenges of navigating the complexities of soil contamination and land use policies. This episode explores how urban roots makes fresh produce more accessible to all and improves the quality of life for local communities. Richie also delves into the importance of exploring farm policy and promoting change within the agricultural industry, touching on topics including corporate dominance, the scarcity of young farmers, and the potential for urban farming to encourage greater diversity in farming. I'm so excited to be releasing my first podcast episode, and I hope that you enjoy listening to it as much as I did making it. I appreciate you listening. Enjoy the conversation. Thank you, Richie, for being my first guest here. I'm very excited. I'm glad we were able to meet on this awfully cold day. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you for taking the leap to be my first guest.
My pleasure.
It's hard to get people to kind of join in on the train when you don't have any reputation, so I really appreciate it in our conversation earlier as well. So getting right into it, you have an extensive education and background. You're doing your PhD in agro-food systems, farm policy, and ownership dynamics. You also have an incredible professional background as well, having taught at 3 post-secondary institutions and currently are teaching at one. You're the founding director of Urban Roots, and you've also co-owned a cafe, as well as have numerous national memberships. So you're obviously very driven. You've gotten London's 20 under 40. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
20 under 40. Okay. Yeah. So you're incredibly driven from my research. Like you're doing good in the world. It's awesome. How did you channel this energy into agriculture?
Yeah. Thank you for the very generous introduction. I think, for me, agriculture is a journey that does start at home. My parents farm still, and a lot of my extended family also farms, and my previous generations before that in my family have been farming for quite some time. So I had that connection as a child, but I will say that I wasn't as engaged with it until later in my life. So I sort of, maybe without realizing it, took it for granted. I never complained about living on a farm or growing up on a farm. I always enjoyed it, but it really sort of synthesized for me its importance in university when I started taking courses in the Globalization program that I took in my undergrad. And a lot of the big problems of the world that we talked about did include agriculture and peasant struggles against land control and so on. And that really sparked sort of awareness for me. And I think also around that time, I was always bringing home books to my parents, hey, read this. And my dad in particular was very, I would say, bothered by some of the trends that had been going on over his lifetime. And he was actively seeking out his own books to read and reading other farmers who were trying to get away from what the trajectory was. So the combination of basically my own growing passion and watching some of that happen in my own family, just sort of escalated from there to what it is today.
Okay. So family roots into it, that means a lot for obviously creating a drive when your family is involved. So I'm assuming this was in Southwest Ontario?
Yes.
You're local-ish?
That's right. Yeah, very much rooted here. And most of my family on my father's side is sort of 20 to 25 minutes outside of the city of London. So that's awesome. Where I grew up. And then I've lived my professional life in this area as well.
Cool. And so that explains why you're putting so much work into the city of London, or improving the quality of life for several people here. Let's talk about Urban Roots. So you're the founding director of Urban Roots, which I'll let you explain what it is, what you've done, and then I'll try and ask you some questions after that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Urban Roots started in 2017 as a not-for-profit urban farm. East side of London is where we actually are located, but when we first started, we obviously didn't have any land to begin with, so it was just an idea. And the idea was there seems to be a decent amount of vacant space in London. We know that this region of southwestern Ontario is, historically speaking, and today, a sort of breadbasket, so-called, in terms of soil. So we could grow food, we thought, and there's a need for making fresh produce more accessible to more people, given its cost in most cases, especially things that are, say, organic, which tend to come with an even higher premium. We'd seen a bunch of analogs, in other cities like Detroit, and they were doing amazing work sort of after the fallout of the 07-08 financial crisis. These amazing vegetable farms are popping up right in the city because there's so much vacant land. But one of the real challenges that they had was they were funded through one source only, and that was the municipal government. So a lot of people that we had spoke to were pretty nervous about, political change, and they might lose all their funding, and they were giving away all their produce for free. So that insight is what led to what Urban Roots is kind of most known for at this point, which is our model of thirds.
Yeah, and which is?
Yeah, which is a model which says that we'll donate no less than a third of what we grow, and then we will sell another third at what we consider affordable, which is basically, think half the price of what you pay at a no-frills for vegetables. So help cost recovery, and then another third we'd sell to make a profit through restaurant channels and other sort of normal wholesale selling.
Awesome. To give away a third of your produce is very irregular in this economy, I would say. And to be able to do that and still continue your business is pretty special. From our conversation earlier, you produced 500 pounds of vegetables your first year, and now you're up to 25,000 pounds, 2,500 pounds?
A little less than about 22,000 pounds of food in a year on that piece of land. And you're right, it did start at 500 in the first year when we really had no idea what we were doing. And I think that first year we planted our first seed June 30th, which for any gardener, that's very late.
Yeah.
And that's because we didn't get the land until then. Yeah, since then it's been a lot of learning and a lot of systems put in place and so on. But it's about a little more than an acre in production that's producing that much food.
That seems really unfathomable to produce 22,000 pounds of food on 1 acre. Do you know the typical production of 1 acre of corn per se, or 1 acre of soy?
That's a good question. Certainly something we could look up. I don't have it at the top of my head.
Okay.
And part of the challenge here too would be, weight isn't maybe the best measurement to compare those two things. Of course, 20,000 pounds of vegetables, and I should say it's not just squash, right? We have 30 different vegetables and multiple varieties of each. So it's everything from lettuce and kale to your heavy feeders and squash, potatoes, and so on. But these have very different nutritional values.
True.
And of course, corn in particular, the kind that we grow in this region, is often not even used for food. It may be used for feed for animals, but it's sometimes not even used for that. Right? It's shipped for biofuel and other things like that, which is, I think, a symptom of some of the larger problems that we face.
Thinking about it now, the food grown around here is grown for quantity over quality, where Urban Roots is quite the opposite. It's grown quality over quantity, even though you do produce large amounts of quantity as well. Your remediated urban land that was previously used for something?
Yeah, so in our case, it actually was a horse pasture years ago, which is really helpful for us because the land was quite rich. And then there's a house on the property that was being rented out by the landowners at the time, and then there's this really large backyard, if you will, that was just sort of a pasture that was being not used when we showed up. I should say that we sort of learned early on that we were a little naive in terms of what was possible to grow. A lot of land in the city, unfortunately, and I'm sure I don't have a comprehensive study in front of me to say how many cities are like this, but in London, at least, a lot of land is contaminated with heavy metals, things like lead and so on, and to a level that you could not grow in the land, at least without very expensive remediation first. And then compounding that, when we started, there was no such thing as an urban agriculture policy in London or strategy. So, that's what actually drove us to eventually start more or less knocking on doors of privately owned land and saying, hey, what do you think about this idea? Could we use this land to grow? So yeah, it was really just an open field of grass when we showed up.
That's better than I thought it would be. So
Yeah.
was there like a particularly high organic matter at that point, or where did you face any challenges trying to turn that land into a garden, essentially?
Mm-hmm. So, like I said, fortunately for us, the organic matter was good. It's quite high, really, and it's been our job to make sure that we maintain that and continue to build that, which is not an easy thing necessarily in that process. But many farmers and stewards of the land have shown how you can do that. So our challenge is really just not knowing what we were doing at the start. Yeah. So for example, we tried to turn the sod originally, and we had the wrong tools to even do it. So it took us 12 hours to till a plot of a small section of the land on rotation. Like everybody would take an hour or two, and we'd rotate in and out. And then some other gentleman took pity on us and said, "I think you might need a tractor." And he came and actually tilled it properly for us.
Oh, that's awesome!
Yeah, so that's how it started. We now have much more sophisticated setup, but yeah, really, for us at least, we were, let's try it. And we assumed that there would be people who would be able to help us, and that turned out to be very true.
That's pretty amazing.
It is fun to think about. It's just certainly part of my memory, but you don't necessarily see that memory when you're in it now, because it's a very different it's organization.
Very well established, I would say, and has a growing presence as well. So facing challenges like that, did you find that there was a lot of support from the community? Did you also find that there was a lot of people who did not want a garden or large garden in the city or in their area, perhaps?
That's a good question. I think so. Support from the city was, I think, quite strong. That first day that we planted was actually all volunteers that we just put a call on Facebook and said, hey, for these new people that are going to try to do this thing, does anyone have seeds and knowledge of gardening? And I think it was 15 volunteers or something that showed up on that first day. And so, and that wasn't just, our friends, it was people we'd never met before, which is pretty amazing. So all those seeds were donated. And then, things like that, we ran a GoFundMe to start, and we have a couple $1,000s. That was our initial to start this organization. And there's much larger examples of that. I don't know, we might get into this later, but, ultimately the community helped us buy that land. So that's a pretty substantial vote of confidence in terms of wanting something like this to exist. Now, we certainly were aware, and this is part of the challenge with the policies, that community gardens are well established. People know what these are, but to say an urban farm, and still to this day, they can get sort of just mushed together. And people say oh, you mean a community garden, and you'll have a bunch of people coming to it. And it's well, no, not exactly, right? We're more production oriented, and it's not for individual use per se. So there's some barriers there. And then, like I said, a lot of we did look at a number of other areas and vacant properties, even privately owned, but the contamination, even the density, I think, of some of the neighborhoods would have posed more challenges to some of the things that we're now doing. We have a fairly large couple of heated high tunnels, which would not likely be possible in, say, a very small, dense neighborhood, right? For understandable reasons.
So those high tunnels allow you to produce longer on each end of the season. Mm-hmm. So how many months of the year do you guys produce vegetables?
We're officially at 12 now.
Are you really?
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah, there's spinach right now. I think it's minus 18, but it's slow growing. But both high tunnels this year are running basically some greens throughout the winter. But otherwise, primary production still remains around the 9 to 10 month range, depending on what kind of crops you're talking about. And we have a number of other sort of tunnel structures that help extend both on the front and the back end of the growing season.
Okay. So January, February are the slow months, more or less?
I would say the slowest. Of course, if you talk to the farm manager, he would tell you that it's slow visibly, but eagerly, and spending lots of time planning and starting our seedlings. So starting all the crops needed for this coming year needs to happen pretty early in the year. So
okay, and does that happen on site as well? You guys all on site?
Unfortunately, that isn't yet what we can
Okay.
do. So over the years, we've had different locations. The last few years, we've rented a space in the basement of Reforest London, which is another
Hmm.
nonprofit organization here, fairly well known for their work planting trees. So they have a space in their basement that we rent out to grow this, to start all of our seedlings right now. And they're relatively close to us, but it is still a little bit of a challenge to be shipping even between those two sites to our home site. We do hope that with now the high tunnels, that there's a possibility we can bring at least some or all of that to the same site.
That would be super cool.
Yeah.
Be able to do everything on site. Yeah, just to think that 7 years ago now, that was dilapidated pasture or abandoned pasture, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's amazing. And do you think that Urban Roots, the model that you've conceived now, is replicable and able, like if someone in their city wanted to have an urban farm,
Mm-hmm.
are they able to take what you guys have done and replicate it? Is it pretty easy to replicate?
So I think it can be replicated, and certainly Urban Roots, actually, the organization always said that we're not here to start a franchise model and like go to other cities necessarily and start doing exactly what we're doing here. But we do hope that, like we took inspiration from others in other cities, that others will do the same with us and then apply it to their specific context. Because besides policy context, which is huge, right? So how supportive is a city about things like urban agriculture is going to change the viability of a model like this. How big is the center? How much land is truly available? And these are all really place-specific questions, I think. And we are a model that helps generate, but not fully generate. Like, we do not pay for every operating expense through our model of thirds. It certainly helps pay for what we do, but we still are dependent upon grant writing and raising money through sort of typical donations, and that's not an easy balance. So I think it's a possibility, a possible solution that can work with amendments in each different location. And I mean, I've been encouraged, I guess, to see that even in London, we've seen more urban agriculture activity since we started, different iterations of what we're doing. And there's a couple of other sites that we now help support that are not our home location.
Those other sites are those other entities, or is that Urban Roots as well?
There's both.
Okay.
We've sort of quasi consulted for starting up a couple of gardens, and then there's Parkwood Hospital site, which we run with the hospital, and all that food actually just goes right into their food program, so it never leaves the site, and that's been a really interesting and rewarding relationship in the last couple of years. And it's not a high production site yet; it's very new. It has its own host of challenges because we had to grow above ground. It was very low grade subsoil basically that we were starting with. But the veterans that live there have been very adamant and appreciative of the type of quality and of produce that comes out of that garden. So it's been pretty cool. And the other site is another partnership that is on a church property in the northeast end of the city. And they actually had proposed a garden and were told no by the city originally. And then they proposed a partnership with us, and they were able to sort of get past some of those hurdles, which is, I don't think that's a good thing. I think part of that is a symptom of the policies that can restrict a lot of this from happening. But it has now been in a 3 years in operation, and it's not nearly as large as our home site, but still producing a couple thousand pounds of food every year.
I mean, that's substantial. I don't know how much a human eats per year, but I imagine 2,000 pounds is a pretty large chunk of it, if not
I'm
all
sure we
of
could
it.
Google that.
Yeah, I think we could. There's been a lot of gardens slash farms starting to pop up in and around the city. How do you think that will affect the expansion of the city? Do you think that now that they're becoming more recognized or popularized, that the city will consider like maintaining pieces of land when they are going to expand?
I mean, I can certainly hope and dream. I don't know that it seems likely yet. There certainly is some momentum, although I know people in my world are also sort of nervous that we're urban agriculture is a thing that is sort of exciting and getting a lot of attention, but then of course something else comes along and then that becomes less exciting. This is the nature of really anyone in particularly the nonprofit sector. So whether that momentum will be sustained long enough with other bigger challenges that we're facing environmentally and so on, again, I hope so. There certainly are politicians who are pushing for real different thinking around how we develop and expand cities. But yeah, I don't know if at this point I could say I feel super confident in that happening.
Okay, but that would be good to have, essentially, like for going forward, for the resilience of a city and reducing supply chains, and just especially like here in Southwest Ontario, the soil is so, like as you said, like a breadbasket. So why would we cover that with pavement and not preserve any for actually growing? Which I can't say it's an intended purpose, but it sure is a very good purpose to have for the soil here.
Right. So I certainly agree, and I think, to me at least, it does seem beneficial to imagine a sort of robust food ecosystem, which London already has, a lot of really good things to say about that. We talk a lot about being a food city because we're surrounded by agriculture, and there are a number of even larger scale food manufacturers and all this kind of thing, which is fine. But yeah, could we maybe think more about how do we supply this city with food that actually is closer to us? So yeah, that insulates you from supply chain shocks and gives an opportunity for access to land for particularly young people who are eager to farm, eager to get access to land and work the land. And we know that that's really challenging in a rural setting. So we have a peri-urban line that could be used in a way that has smaller scale land for agriculture, maybe held in a trust model, that I think would be incredibly beneficial for a lot of reasons.
To complete the math that we did earlier for how many pounds a person eats per year, and then how much you can produce per acre, how many acres would London need to subsidize even like 20% of the city's diet on local, like hyper local farms? I can't imagine it would be so big, but that it would maybe seem manageable. But maybe I'm also way wrong. It's 500,000 people, just about, quite a lot.
Yeah, I don't know the math exactly, but I think it wouldn't be impossible to have let's say, significant chunk. And to be clear, there's also a number of vegetable farms in the surrounding area outside of the center that are also part of that ecosystem, currently supplying London in the way that they can. But there's certainly it's still a very small percentage of the total produce that's eaten.
Solange and I go to the market on Saturdays, and Western Fair, and we get our vegetables from Patricia's Farm Market, which they grow a lot of. I believe they don't sell any vegetables that they don't grow or that aren't locally grown. And I believe we looked it up how far they are, because we wanted to do a 100-kilometer diet for May, because that's probably like one of the better months to do that. But they're 170 kilometers away. Oh, wow. So, but they're I would consider them a local producer, because they're there every weekend. It's like, what is I guess at a point of 170 kilometers, your area of supply is quite large, or can be, because we're also similar distance away from Toronto, I would say. So like anywhere between London and Toronto, if there's producers, they obviously have no shortage of buyers.
Yeah.
So would that mean that there's an opportunity for more producers at that point, essentially?
Yeah, one of the people I look up to is Chris at Common Ground Farm, and they have really expanded their production and service London and St. Thomas, but now are starting to move into the GTA market because they have surplus to do that. And of course, the GTA is a massive consumer market. I mean, this sort of urban, we've gone from a very agrarian society to a very urban society, and so the amount of flows that need to go into the city certainly can't sustain itself without this, is quite large. And I think we can comfortably see a lot more demand for sourcing locally, even if that means, within Southwestern Ontario, for example. I mean, it's still far more local than California or France or wherever else we pull from.
The other week they didn't have any bell peppers, and so we bought them elsewhere, and they had stickers on them from Spain. And I was like,
Yeah.
whoa, peppers from Spain and in January. I was like, man, this is traveled halfway across the world, and it's like still fresh, right? So I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. I would imagine that has to be transported via plane.
Mm-hmm. Yep, a lot of stuff is by
Yeah,
plane with cargo planes, which is a wild concept, but
super wild concept.
modern technology has made us. I believe really that we're really removed from this. How many times in a day do I think about an airplane flying with peppers? I mean, zero, right? And I'm in this world, right? And so I would suggest that most of us aren't thinking about that because it's out of sight. And I think that's one of the best examples of the modern economy is things are out of sight, and therefore they just exist, and we don't inherently see problems that may be underpinning those practices. So I think that's one of the challenges really with mobilizing people to care and want to do things differently is why would they need to, right? The peppers from Spain are there, right? They're sitting on the shelf. You buy them, that's it.
Yeah.
Right? So we have a long way to go, and I hope certainly that we, as a society, as a community, can think about these problems before they become acute, and the airplane doesn't fly, and all of a sudden we don't have the vegetables, and we're in a panic. I think there is lots of little nodes of hope that show that people are thinking about that, and hopefully more and more people can think
Yeah.
about it.
A lot of what I've read and researched, it seems like there's two very distinct directions that agriculture is going right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's a return to more like regenerative, natural, holistic practices, or to a very technological front, which is, like hydroponics and indoor growing. What are your perspectives on that? Like, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I think that having both is good in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
What are your perspectives on that?
It's a big question for sure. It opens a few different directions I could go. I think first of all, like the trend, the predominant trend in agriculture production, certainly in North America, but not only there, has been that we need less farmers, and that's okay because the farmers who remain are big, and therefore they are efficient because they are big. Unfortunately, I think that there's a lot missing from that story, and particularly the lives of people in rural settings have been decimated in real bad ways. And even those who are currently sort of elevated as successful and doing all the right things, if you talk to them, they will very often admit how much pressure they're under, how much debt they have to carry, and how much capital they have to lay out just to sustain what they're doing at such low margins. And so for me, that continued trajectory ends in one place, and that's ruin. To be very pessimistic, I guess.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, and this is more from a global perspective, the peasant movement of farm agrarian workers has been quite resilient in the face of all these challenges. And the reality is that most small scale farms are still the primary producers of food in the world. Now, so there's a lot of nuance and a lot of different context there, and I always get uncomfortable with universalized statements because there's also real challenges of poverty and so on in some of these places. But again, the poverty may not be because they are peasant farmers, and in many cases it might be because of the systems placed on top of them from other more globally powerful corporations and governments and so on that have undermined their entire market and so on. But that's one train of thought that I can go down. But the other, I think, thread in your question is now I think more and more we hear that, well, we have technological solutions that can alleviate maybe some of my concerns about the large scale chemical company problems that we see in industrial ag. And so far, I guess, one of the challenges that I see is that a lot of these solutions require significant privilege and access to do them. So it doesn't mean that growing hydroponically is inherently bad or not a good environmental choice in some cases. But to do that, it requires a certain amount of privilege and access to capital, for example. And often, I think those at a larger scale lead to some of the same problems that I was just mentioning in our more traditional large-scale industrial farming that we've seen in the last 50 years. Now, technology, again, is something that is used every day by every farmer across the world, but we just don't see it in the same way, perhaps, as we do the shiny new toys, right? Like the big new vertical farm with lights from first floor to floor 50, whatever it is, seems amazing, and it's a feat of human engineering, which is impressive. But we don't consider the micro scale, we'll say multi-use hand tools that dramatically reduce time in the field for someone who's, say, doing small scale vegetable production. But that's technological innovation, right? But it's not going to be celebrated on Dragon's Den or something, right?
Yeah.
So there's kind of these competing forces, I'll say, and I guess I'm a little bit on the skeptical side of technology, big tech fixes being any different than what they were when they said, hey, we've brought out these wonderful new chemicals that were used for weapons into now controlling your pests and boosting your yields, and that led us down not a great path. And all these other things at a large scale require intense amounts of resources. From where?
Yeah.
And that's a really, I think, hard question to answer.
Yeah. So they have a responsibility to, I guess, direct their growth and hopefully learn from the lessons of fertilizer and chemicals and not follow the same trajectory and be able to be unconsolidated, perhaps would be the word.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if there was, I'd be happy to see, locally controlled pockets of, say, vertical and hydroponic growing that's, down in a street from a whole bunch of restaurants and supplying them instead of, shipping microgreens from, across the country. That does make sense to me, right?
Yeah.
And maybe it's using an abandoned office building that isn't going to be otherwise utilized, right? That makes even more sense. But yeah, I don't know that, that's necessarily the way it's approached, because, like I said, to start this, you usually need a lot of access to capital. So that requires a certain subset of people with access to, say, venture capital. And now we're talking about what matters is return.
Yeah.
How fast can you get a return on investment? How big do you have to scale? How quickly can you do that? And none of that aligns with what I just was talking about would be nice and ideal for, making a more robust community that has control and say over their food production.
Slippery slope.
Indeed.
Just to think of that, when you mentioned putting it in a abandoned building, that in another sense is like hyper urban roots, like to consider, like, I couldn't even imagine that, or I've never even thought of that before, to look at a building and say, that's where all our vegetables are grown for the city. What? It's a very futuristic approach. So since we've talked about consolidation a little bit, would you like to talk some more about your PhD and what you're researching there?
Sure, yeah. I'll try not to go on too long here, but I am, as you can probably tell, particularly interested in not just understanding in more detail how and why this consolidation has come to pass. And that's been, I think, fairly well documented by many scholars and farmers over the many decades. But, and for my case, I'm most interested in Ontario because it's where I'm from. And there's 444 municipalities here. About half of those are rural. And I think understanding what land use policies exist, and they're not the same across different townships and counties is a good place to start in some of this understanding. And then I'm most interested in how do we find real ways that we can change policy and allow for young people to farm in the future. And it's clear to me, at least, that a lot of those young people are interested in vegetable market garden style farming. It's not the only way, but one of the reasons that's so attractive is because the direct to consumer gives the possibility for the farmer to take back so much of the margin that's been stolen by the other models of commodity production, where there's basically zero control for the farmer to take any cut. If they get it, it's because commodity markets were in their favor that year. So it's rolling the dice. So even still, you can have a higher margin production of farming, but if you can't access land, it's irrelevant, right? And so right now, most farm land is 100 acres. Occasionally there's 50-acre farms, and more those get merged. And there's larger scale players that would like to see that increase further to closer to 200 acres per farmland plot. So at current land prices, you're now talking about, excuse me, millions of dollars, which is not feasible for even someone who may be coming from a farm family to move into that industry. So that's what I'm concerned with, and what my research will be really focused on understanding in more detail. So starting with the sort of historical lens of how we got here, understand the policy landscape as it exists, and then get a clear sense from those who are living and farming in these communities today, what it is that allowed them to do that, and how they're doing, or what barriers they're facing, so that, like I said, hopefully there can be more clear pathways for future folks to farm. And this all goes back to sort of the census data that I find quite alarming, which is that in Canada, at least, we now have just north of 260,000 farmers across the entire country, and obviously represents a very small percentage of 40 plus million people, and that has been clearly in decline for basically every census since the 1930s. And the average age is now 56 years old for a farmer, and that's alarming enough on its own. But the number of farmers under the age of 35, which presumably is our next generation of farmers, is less than 8 or 9% of that farm population.
Whoa.
So this trend is continuing and about to continue at a quite alarming rate, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So that's what that data says to me, and why I'm so concerned with it.
To do some not so accurate quick math, for simplicity's sake, we'll say 250,000 farmers, and we'll say 40 million people in Canada. So if there was 500,000, that would be 80. Let's do some quick math.
Yeah, you're talking about like 25,000 or so young farmers.
That's a huge burden. That's crazy to think about. Can you think of any other comparable industry in Canada or the world in which such a small portion of people support the entire country?
I don't want to say that it doesn't exist, because I'm not an expert in other industries. I'm sure there probably are some other industries where you see some kind of trend like this, but I think this one is of pretty significant importance. And you say, interestingly, like, and this is the narrative that we still use today, which is that Canadian farmers feed Canadian people, but that's of course not really the case, right? Like in some examples, yes, but for the most part, that consolidated industrial ag has led to we export. And if you go on Agro Canada's website, it's all about bigger, more more export, how to find more global markets, and this has just been the line that's been given as it's the only way, right? And again, assuming all those supply chains continue to exist the way that they do now, and I'm not sure why we think that's such an obvious conclusion, right? I think sometimes in these conversations, people say, well, we've globalized and it'll never be different. Well, I mean, we have a lot of history where we weren't globalized, first of all. Second of all, this globalization has happened primarily on the backs of very specific things like access to cheap energy and an exploitation of cheap labor. I mean, at some point, those things may not always exist in the way that they exist now. And I think that it's worth considering that you might not have a shipping container coming across the entire ocean for a bunch of gadgets and gadgets on a whatever minute by minute basis that we have now in the future. And if so, then we do care about how many people with knowledge of growing food we have in our society. And so it's hard. Again, you may not see that immediately because things continue to go as they have for the last number of decades, but that's a very small timeline, right, in the grand scheme of history.
From 1930 to now, less than 100 years. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And do you think that the population of, we'll say, practicing farmers is inverse to the diversity of farmable landowners? Would that make sense?
Which is, sorry, to say that there's the fewer farmers there are, the less diversity
in land ownership.
I think, yes, that tends to be the case. Canada maybe has less visible examples of this, but I mean, the United States is, pretty clear. I forget the exact data on this, but the number of Black farmers that own land is sadly low from what it was for in the last sort of same time frame.
Yeah.
And there's no signs of that maybe changing unless policies change dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of talk about U.S. farm policy. How much does the USDA or farm policy within the U.S. influence Canada, or is there any reverse influence? Does Canada influence the states at all? And then what makes Canada's farm policies stand out, or like what are some of the policies that are unique to Canada?
Mm-hmm. So I think there's no question that the U.S. Farm Bill, which is coming up, has a pretty direct impact on Canadian farmers, in part because it can have things like domestic buying priorities and certain commodities. That, another thing that just came to mind is not necessarily directly related to that Farm Bill, but when the mad cow disease happened, this was basically an immediate no to any Canadian beef crossing the border, which had a huge impact on how Canadian beef production looked after that. And we know that the U.S. market is, of course, 10x what Canada is, so they have just power in that alone. It's a little harder to draw lines on how Canadian policy may influence the U.S., although, again, they are an export partner. So I think, again, if you dig through Canadian Canada agro-food policy priorities, a lot of it does center around deepening partnerships with exporters who are often US based, but now increasingly also all over the world. And you don't see too much talked about, although there's some hope now with the upcoming US bill that there will be some more conversation about what regenerative agriculture looks like and could be supported more directly than it has been. Because the other well-known fact is that industrial agriculture has been subsidized heavily by government for a long time, and it gets, I think, unfortunately lumped into as saving farmers, but it's lifting up a system, and who's getting the support is actually the corporations that are just exploiting these farmers and then getting the benefits of these subsidies. So in effect, you have a government that's just paying people like Cargill billions of dollars to continue exploiting farmers.
Yeah,
so
indirectly.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. 'Cause from my understanding of subsidies is, we'll say farmer A grows corn, and to meet your, I guess, to meet your return, we'll say it's like 1,000 units. If they get 800 units, then they get the subsidy to replace those 200 units. If they get over 1,000 units, good for them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then they just like, that perpetuates the cycle. As long as they grow corn, it doesn't matter how much they grow,
Mm-hmm.
they're going to get their units essentially.
Often, I mean, there's some variance, but a lot of the subsidy programs are sort of yield protection type programs. And like you said, they're often oriented around certain commodity crops in particular, and corn is, a good example of that.
Mm-hmm. It's diving into agriculture for me has been, like, if you would have asked me probably 5 years ago, 6 years ago about agriculture, I'd be like, so what? They grow things,
Mm-hmm.
But now that I've like looking at it from an ecological lens and being able to look at it and also learning about policy, I think learning about policy was the thing that has really opened my eyes to it. And then also how it's just such an interesting topic because the current like conventional agriculture has been practiced for 80 years or so, like since
it depends what we call
100
conventional,
years.
but
Yeah.
like, agriculture, long history, and much of it, some people draw the line of conventional, many hundreds of years before, but industrial agriculture
industrial
is certainly a more modern invention.
It's crazy to think that we've latched onto it so tightly that to shift away from industrial agriculture now, it almost seems like we need a leap of faith. Like how many units of food can be produced per acre on a industrial farm, which is grown for quantity over quality, versus like an acre, say like at Urban Roots or at farm practicing regenerative agriculture. Can they have the same yields, and what are the profit margins? Because you like practicing regenerative agriculture, you definitely don't need all of the chemicals that you would need for industrial agriculture.
Yeah.
Do you have any insight on regenerative practices? Also with the Farm Bill, what defines a regenerative practice and who will it exclude if they come up with a definition?
Yeah.
It's a tricky one. I've heard of this.
Yeah. That's a good question. So I think inevitably when these kinds of debates or questions come up about, can small scale farms feed the world, so-called, and it's usually a calorie count, which I think is just really misguided. The amount of land that we use now for, like I said, things that are biofuel production, which has absolutely nothing to do with feeding anybody in any location. If you eliminate all that land tomorrow and turn that into vegetable production or other food crops, that alone would be a massive shift in what's available. And then there's and this gets into lots of other debates, but whether animals should be in production at all and so on. But again, even if you eliminated feed for cattle, which are in concentrated feedlots, which very few people will defend as a good practice for a number of very clear reasons, environmentally and otherwise. And that's not saying you can't have, let's say, cattle on pasture. You have far less than we do now because of the lack of concentration. But again, that would also have huge environmental and social consequences, I think, positively. But anyway, so there's that. But the regenerative conversation is a tricky one because that word in particular has become the word of the day for a lot of people. And as we see, it was not that long ago, sustainability was the word of the day. And every corporation everywhere has a sustainability officer, executive, and it can mean a lot of different things and sort of be greenwashed. And so we can see that happen in regenerative agriculture as well. And the other reality is, and many people have pointed this out, like regenerative is often sort of just referring to known practices that have been used for centuries, primarily by indigenous groups, but even by farms that used to be more mixed farms not that long ago before the industrialization of agriculture. And so it's almost a rebrand of something. And that can also come with sort of colonial undertones of, hey, we suddenly magically discovered this, thing. And of course, no, we didn't. Right? It's already been knowledge for a long time. So that can definitely be exclusionary in its implementation.
Another point that I've heard is that, agriculture is so unique to the piece of land that it's on.
Yep.
And so a regenerative practice may be suitable for one area, but not another.
Yep.
And if you define regenerative agriculture as including that practice, and this farm excludes it because it's not the best for them, then they're not regenerative. And then all of a sudden, they aren't able to use that regenerative label.
Right.
And then it just creates a whole mess, obviously.
Yeah, and if it becomes a labeling system, much like organic, then 100%. You see this kind of the fact that Costco and Walmart are stocked top to bottom with organic tells you there's probably some flexibility in what that actually means at a standardized level. So what I mean by flexible is not that it's place-based, but that it's bended enough to allow for basically status quo to continue and us to call it something else. And that's very different from what you just said, which I think is the most important thing. Like I've always said that Adam, whether you agree with all of the different things, there's lots of nuances in all of these conversations we've had. Ultimately, I think more eyes on acres, more people that know the land intimately, and this is kind of what my favorite writer Wendell Berry has been writing about for 50 years. That is, in my opinion, the only true hope we have in keeping land healthy and restored. And I just don't have the faith that some kind of universalized, one size fits all, even environmentally positive policy is going to come anywhere close to doing that, because ecology is complicated and we are a part of that as a human, and we have to find a way to work within that. And we have so far, I'll go back to my word, abstracted ourselves from it, that we assume we can sort of from the outside say, how do we better manage this ecology without putting ourselves in it? And I think that's a mistake.
That's a really interesting point to bring up. It made me think that we are trying to define the natural world within a set of bounds. And by doing that, we create limits for what we see as the natural world and what we recognize as perhaps a natural process. So I think we're almost putting on the blinders by defining what the practice would be, especially when it comes to regenerative agriculture. Do you think that a policy that would, rather than identify what practices are, but instead monitor a certain criteria of metrics would be better? Like say like organic matter, and then like we'll say mycorrhiza per cubic foot of soil, and like factors like that measure that are able to put a number on the ecology. Do you think that a system like that, like it doesn't matter essentially how you regenerate those, but as long as you're able to prove that you're consistently producing equal or more to be regenerative per year, do you think that would be a better suited system if they had to label it?
I'm torn on this one. Like I hear you, and part of me wants to say, certainly yes, I think that's maybe better than some of the other blanket style regenerative labels that may come to be. But I think what I'm having a hard time with is that we continue to sort of think through the reductionist scientific lens, which is we just have to measure, label, say like that, and assume really that we know. Because I think one of the things in soil biology science in the last couple of decades has been we know so little, like the amount of diversity that's in the handful of soil, and there's been lots of sort of viral things about talking about that. It's the amount of life in there is almost hard to wrap your head around. Period, and we know a very small subset of that, and how these relationships of living organisms work. That to say, increase X number of, these different things, probably good. We seem to know that makes the land more productive, and it seems to capture carbon, and these are all great things. But it ends up getting us into a single focus, and then we might find out 20 years from now, this is leading to runoff into the water that has super high levels of whatever, right? And so this is the challenge with policy, right? And I started when you asked me about my research, I am interested in policy, and I do think it matters a great deal. But I don't think any policies are going to solve our problems. I think ultimately we have some human problems, which is why they're so hard, because it requires individuals to change, and it requires communities to change. And we're not super open to that, I think, and for lots of reasons. But yeah, I know it's maybe a downer answer, but it's hard because you want enforcement from policy to be pushing us in a positive way. And I would argue that honestly, that's what every policy is intended to do. Mm-hmm. Someone thinks, right? And we not all agree, but so yeah, I think it's maybe probably a yes and in some ways, and I don't want to get labeled a libertarian, but I get an understanding or a sympathy towards these ideas in this context, right? That is it necessary for a bureaucrat in Ottawa or Washington, D.C. to tell somebody in the middle of Iowa or Ontario how to manage their land? And do they actually know any better than that farmer would? Right now, again, I'm not saying we should abolish all policies and get libertarian, right? I'm just expressing that I can have a thread of sympathy for that idea, given this example I just talked about.
Well, that is totally a real world example too. So in the capital is not going to tell me how to run my piece of land.
Sure.
You hear that's real rhetoric. That is a real thing.
And that resentment is capitalized by lots of very divisive political figures, as we know.
Yeah.
To great success. And this is one of the big challenges of our time, I think, which is, how do we have, say, democratic local governance that is strong enough to govern its community? And right now, it's sort of government is like every other corporation that we've seen. They've sort of consolidated power, usually in the highest levels of the White House or the federal government in Canada and we see that sort of sucked out of municipal and even provincial politics. So I think we need that reversed if we have a chance of making good local decisions. And one of the arguments that a lot of these more reactionary politicians will make is that exactly this loss of control that smaller rural communities feel, which is a very true thing. And I don't think their solutions are helpful or correct in most cases, but they've pointed to the right problems, that we need to build more, honestly, political power at a local level to make these decisions. And that you and I, if we're living in the same community, having a true sense of keeping each other accountable for caring for our land and our people, which right now, that's not how our system works at all.
I commonly hear that it doesn't really matter who the president is, or maybe the prime minister, but actually your local mayor or your local jurisdiction, whoever it may be, is the one who will have the largest effect on your life as far as policies go. But I think that is probably the least publicized position out of all of the policy positions, because you can only receive so much viewership, because no one really cares if you're in Saskatchewan who is the mayor of London, Ontario, right? Like, there's probably going to be a very few number,
and nor should they need to.
Exactly.
And I think, and you're right that even with sort of the loss of power of local government, it still is the the place where the decisions that have the most impact on you will happen. I think that's still true. But we are so concerned with the global and the national and these, again, the large abstractions. That's what we've learned in our society, not just our generation, but generations before us, is, you're sort of left to your own devices to succeed, right? The American dream, so-called. And then the bigger problems will be dealt with by, the big people in the big governments and or corporations, for that matter. And I don't think, that leads to very positive outcomes.
It's a whole, to get into policy of agriculture it's frightful, because there is so much weight on it, because people need to eat, but also I think you're wrong no matter what, right? There's always going to be 49% of people who think you're wrong, almost. Like that's probably policy in general, but I think having policy related to food, is maybe even at the national scale, is also a very it's directly felt by the citizens or whoever exports, right? And so getting that right requires a lot. And it's like, how do you think, with your research, we could promote change within the agriculture industry to be more resilient and to be less dependent on large corporations and finances and subsidies?
Yeah. So, setting aside that I do think there's policy changes necessary that I spoke to earlier, primarily around access to land and what you can do on that land. Ultimately, I do think that the greater hope will be in the grassroots type of movement, and making sure that there is a nurturing of that in every possible way. And I think this is overlooked in some ways, but in schools from kindergarten onwards, talking about farming in an honorable way that says this is a viable way that you can spend your life. And I don't think we do that today. And if that is spoken about in a positive way, just like we speak about all kinds of other professions, then I think undoubtedly there'll be more young people interested. And so then the next question is, can we have not just urban roots or others, but urban examples where people can learn how to grow and learn how to farm in a more beyond a community garden. And if those other policies I mentioned earlier can be amended to allow for more land trusts, they give access without capital for young people who have now been encouraged and trained, I think there's a real chance that you'll see maybe an uptick, right? I'm not saying we're going to have 1 million farmers, but this decline that I spoke to earlier, we might be able to halt that and maintain at least 25,000 farmers that are young in the future, and maybe even more.
25,000 farmers. It's not many. Well, then, we will just get into some questions I wrote for you. Is there anything I should have asked you but didn't?
I actually think our conversation is quite wide-ranging. So, and last question got to where I hope things can go, and ultimately, I just hope that more people turn their eyes towards the importance of food production, and in particular the people that are a part of that. Because I sometimes do think that some of the debates will lead to, even modern environmental movements will say that farmers are kind of the problem, and I understand that impulse, but I think it's a little misguided. And in most cases, I think the farmers are suffering within a system that has been created that led to the kinds of practices that we have as normal. And I don't think it's a productive way of moving forward to demonize the people that are producing food. But it's tough when there's so many big challenges, and
A little empathy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a little empathy, I think, goes a long way.
Next, what does a successful future look like to you? I know we've kind of already touched on it. Is there any points you'd like to add?
I'll just say more young farmers,
Young farmers?
and
Yeah.
from different backgrounds. Like as soon as when you say urban, this usually opens the door to far greater diversity than we have currently, and there are great organizations, Ecological Farmers of Ontario, National Farmers Union, and others that are working really intentionally to help build access to folks that currently aren't part of the rural landscape.
Awesome. Those are good resources. I'll make sure to link those. What makes you hopeful?
It is those kinds of organizations, but meeting these people that have, even in all this bleak context that I been talking about for so long, that there are still young new farmers that are finding a way to make it happen, because they believe that it's worthwhile and it's something that's important to them. So those are always the people that give me the most hope. Anyone who treats their world, their land, their community, their people as sacred places, to me is inspiring.
Awesome. It's got to be inspiring having Wendell Berry on your shelf there. And last but not least, are there any resources that you'd like to share where people can learn more?
Depending on what kind of learning people want to do, right? Like, I think there's no shortage of books and, like I said, organizations that you can seek out and look into. If you want sort of I do think some of Wendell Berry's early work gives people a good starting point on the philosophy that has led us to where we are now. And he was very early in sort of critiquing where things ended up going. But then, of course, there's plenty of modern writers that are echoing these same kinds of sentiments. So yeah, if you just want excitement from new farms, then I would go to the EFAO, the NFUs of the world, and just look at what some of their farmers are doing, and I think you'll be probably inspired.
Awesome. Well, that's all I have for you today, Richie. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
it's been an awesome conversation.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for learning with me today and dedicating your time listening to Vistas and Voices. Time is our most valuable asset, and I'm grateful that you chose to share some of yours with me today. If today's episode struck a chord with you, I'd be honored if you could share it with friends, family, or colleagues who you think would enjoy it too. Every share, particularly those made through personal recommendations, plays a significant role in nurturing our growing community. Furthermore, if you could take a moment to leave a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you tune in, it would be immensely supportive. Your feedback is precious to me. It not only aids in enhancing our content, but it also helps others find our conversations. Please feel free to reach out to me via my website, www.thePursuitProject.org/contact, on Instagram @Tyler_Garwood, or on LinkedIn. Your thoughts, questions, and feedback are always greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to our next episode, where I'll see you right here on Vistas and Voices.